If you've seen Devil's Advocate before, this very series, then you will know that at some point in the episode, I usually define this series as a conversation that would occur. If you came up to me and you were like, "Oh, you like MMA, you watch a lot of MMA. How does this underdog beat this favourite in their upcoming fight," right? If you come up to me like 2 years ago and said, "Who do you think is going to win? Why can Tony Ferguson beat Paddy Pimblett?" First of all, I'd be like,
"You're a proper helmet."
What are you talking about? Tony Ferguson's one of the best lightweights in the world. And also, I would have been like, why are you talking about nonsense fights that are never going to happen? Because let me talk about the history, my history with these two guys for a brief moment. As a UK fight fan, I have been watching Paddy Pimblett for a long time, since his early Cage Warriors days. I have interviewed Paddy Pimblett for Cage Warriors in the past. It goes back far, and so I very much enjoyed seeing Paddy become a huge star in the UFC in his first couple of fights, and then we've gone through all of the ups and downs with the controversy around him and all of these things, and then you've got Tony Ferguson. Right, so you've got Paddy on one corner, a guy that I have watched for a long time, that I've spoken to a fair few times, and he is whatever you see on camera, whatever you think of him, he is a lovely guy and he's incredibly humble. But Tony Ferguson, if you were to ask me who my favourite fighter to watch of all time is, it would probably be Tony Ferguson, right? That El Kukui run in the lightweight division, that incredible win streak, and all of the incredible fights that were in it is the most fun I've ever had watching anyone in MMA, I think. And now you have a scenario where these two guys are fighting. And that is crazy to me. I still can't believe this is happening. And a lot of people couldn't believe it was happening, but for different reasons. They couldn't believe it was happening because normally there would be a point in these videos where I go, okay, well, let's talk about why this person is the underdog before we talk about why they can win despite being the underdog. It's pretty clear why Tony Ferguson is the underdog in this fight. He has lost 6 fights in a row. Paddy Pimblett has won 5 in a row since debuting in the UFC. There was the debut. Second guy. Was it 4? Jared Gordon the 4th? That makes it sound like it's his title. Whatever. It doesn't matter. Paddy Pimblett's on a win streak. Tony Ferguson is 1 fight away from tying the record for the longest losing streak in UFC history. Of course, BJ Penn has 7. So this is a tough one because I have a lot of time for Paddy Pimblett, despite what a lot of people think about him. And Tony Ferguson, like I said, my favourite fighter to watch of all time, and he might be about to tie the UFC losing streak. Despite at one point, I was firmly on the Tony Ferguson is the best lightweight in the world hype train, despite the fact that I never really thought he would beat Khabib. But you know, that is another conversation for another day. Maybe that could be a devil's advocate sometime. I don't know. So it's clear to see why people kicked off about this matchup and why people were like, "Oh, this is nonsense matchmaking. They're giving Tony to Paddy to build Paddy, whatever." And I think that it's not as simple as that. You've seen a lot of people come out and be like, "It's kind of a lose-lose for Paddy in some way," and I think that there is some truth to that. Although the UFC, I don't think will see it that way. They will definitely be like, you know, if Paddy wins, they'll be like, he just beat a former interim champion, right? But let's talk about Tony Ferguson, because we'll get to Paddy and how this all relates to Paddy at the end. I went back and I watched the losing streak. Now, when I say I watched the losing streak, I watched the last 3, and the reason I didn't watch the first 3 losses on this streak is because, first of all, the first one came to Justin Gaethje in an interim title fight. I don't think there's anything for me to learn about this fight against Pimblett from that fight against Gaethje in 2020. So, that's whatever. And then Charles Oliveira and Beneil Dariush, 2 of the best grapplers in the division, if not the UFC, took him down and held him down, and you were like, Tony's wrestling is maybe not as good as we once thought. I don't think wrestling is going to come into this fight too much. My reason for that, I'm going to compare this to when I argued for Yuri Prochazka beating Alex Pereira at UFC 295. Both Tony and Yuri Prochazka are pretty good all-round mixed martial artists, and yet both of them don't tend to use their overall skills. Of course, Tony will do weird things like go for Imanari rolls to look for submissions, but in terms of shooting a double leg or a single leg, I couldn't tell you the last time I saw him do it. So I'm not expecting this to come into it. And that has both positive and negative connotations for me when it comes to Tony Ferguson, because if you ask me if Tony Ferguson is a better wrestler than Paddy Pimblett, I would say, yeah, he probably is, right? Of course, he has a legit wrestling background. Is he a better submission guy than Paddy Pimblett? Paddy's very good with his submissions, very good opportunistic and creative submissions. Tony tends to beat people up and then submit them. It's tough. They have different skill sets in submissions, but that's not important, right? I just don't think it's going to be used in this fight. And again, like I said, positive and negatives. Positives being that Paddy is very good at opportunistic submissions, and I have watched him fight people that come in with the game plan of taking him down so many times, and he ends up submitting them off of his back or just defending the takedown and damaging them for it. So, like I said, positive and negatives. So let's talk about the first loss that we're actually going to dive into, which was the Michael Chandler loss for Tony Ferguson. And of course, as a lot of people will remember, Tony Ferguson looked really good for a lot of the first round. I would say that watching this fight back, I was like, this is the El Kukui that I remember, man. Like, stalking Michael Chandler down. His counter, yeah, he still ate some shots. Of course he did. It's Tony Ferguson. But his work rate was fantastic. His counters looked very, very good, very sharp. And not, we'll get to this later on, but not like he was just thinking of something and then doing it. It felt a bit more like he knew what he was going to do, if that makes sense, right? And we'll get, as I said, further on this as we get on. But he looked fast, he looked dangerous, trademark pressure, constant rolling with his shoulders to avoid shots. And then he gets taken down at the end of the first round and beaten up for well, mostly held down, but beaten up a little bit. And then, of course, second round starts and that crazy front kick knockout, right? Which is the kind of KO that will change a fighter. And when you're on a 4-fight losing streak, it'll definitely change a fighter. So then the Nate Diaz fight, and I originally wasn't going to rewatch this one because I just remember watching this fight and being like, well, that was a weird moment in time. We'll just chalk that up to being a weird moment in time. But I did go back and watch it again. And the main thing that I took away from it was Tony's striking just seemed way off compared to usual. Even in the Chandler fight, his striking looked pretty good for the most part. Well, actually, his striking looked very good for the most part, right? Like, he gets taken down and then gets front kicked out of nowhere, and you're like, okay, it is what it is. But it was like he was still learning the button combinations on a fighting game. It just seemed so sporadic and such little focus in terms of what the main weapons were, where Diaz was going to be. And Diaz basically ended up winning, apart from obviously the submission, which ended the fight. He basically ended up winning every round just because he landed more frequently. Because Diaz's game is so fundamentals, right? And I don't mean that in a bad way. His boxing skills in MMA, caveat, is very, very good. And so just by sticking to simple stuff, he was just able to keep tagging Tony. And as much as everyone, when you think about that lightweight run of Tony Ferguson, you think of all the crazy elbows, knees, spinning attacks, right? Everyone remembers all that stuff. But if you go back and watch a lot of those fights, they are all built off of him just constantly landing, whether it's front kicks, leg kicks, jabs, combinations. He's just constantly coming at you with something, right? It's like perpetual motion. But against Diaz, there was no focus on just landing regularly. Like, Nate Diaz cut so easy, and he had like no marks on his face at the end of 4 rounds against Tony Ferguson. How crazy is that, right? And it was like Nate Diaz, because his boxing frame is so like unwavering, right? He usually stands the exact same way throughout the whole fight, apart from when he's doing silly stuff, right? And it was like trying to, if people know what a Beyblade is.
I don't think you want to tussle with me. Beyblade,
It's like a spinning top that you used to have. I think they were only in the UK, so apologies if that reference is lost on you. But it was like spinning a Beyblade into a wall. It's just like, it just bounces off, right? It was like Nate Diaz is just standing there and Tony would come at him with something and Nate would just stand there, right? And of course his movement, his head movement and his stuff, and it is very good, to give Nate Diaz some credit. I'm not just saying that it was all Tony, but that is the main thing. And then of course you take that and you can apply it right into the fight with Bobby Green. because Tony Ferguson's style doesn't suit very well against people who are very good counter strikers, counter boxers in particular. Nate Diaz, Bobby Green, Justin Gaethje was the one where it was like, if you're just sound defensively and you've got big powerful counters, it can really cause Tony some problems because he's such a creative guy. And we literally saw that the other weekend with Yuri Prochazka and Alex Pereira, right? Yuri Prochazka was catching him with all kinds of stuff that Alex Pereira would have never seen coming. But as soon as it got a little bit more, we've been here before, in comes that left hook, night. Alex Pereira wins the light heavyweight title, right? So it's a difficult one when it comes to counter strikers facing Tony. And the Bobby Green fight is a strange one because I thought Tony again was looking really, really good, back to a little bit of what we'd seen before. Then an eye poke happens that Tony went and said was really bad and really affected his vision. And then from that point on, it just looked frantic again. It looked like the plan went completely out the window and it was like, I'm going to try and catch him with something crazy. And it's like, well, that's all well and good, but it's kind of like throwing... It's kind of like when Michel Pereira were like a lesser degree, because Michel Pereira, when he first debuted in the UFC, was nuts. But, you know, he's throwing all these crazy kicks and you're like, well, this is all well and good and you might knock him out, but you're not winning the round because everything you're throwing has such a small chance of actually landing. I just remember watching Tony against like Cowboy Cerrone and stuff, and he's just constantly hitting him, constant jabs, constant hooks, constant kicks, teeps, everything, right? And that just appears to have gone from Tony's game. So getting back around to Paddy. Paddy doesn't pose some of these threats that some of these guys he's lost to, right? Because one of the things, if you were going to point to why Tony can win this fight, not only has he got a vast more amount of experience, but look at those guys he's lost to, right? The lowest ranked out of all of them. I mean, Nate Diaz is a hard one to quantify, right? But it's Nate or Bobby Green, and Paddy has fought some very good European opposition on his way up to the UFC, but since being in the UFC, he hasn't fought anyone near that caliber, right? I mean, Jared Gordon, I know, fought Bobby Green, but Bobby Green's been on a great run. So that's one of the things you point to, and I think that you can point to the fact that Paddy just doesn't pose some of the threats that a lot of these guys pose. Counter-striking does worry me a little bit because Paddy is a very good opportunistic finisher. He's a big dude and he's explosive, right? So if Tony comes in and again he's doing this crazy stuff where he's just trying to land weird shots, and it's like he's trying to make sure that every shot he throws is different to the last one, which I know kind of makes sense, but it doesn't when you know what I'm talking about, because it's like, it's not just like I'm going to throw a jab and then I'm going to throw a right hand. It's like I'm going to throw a spinning elbow and then I'm going to throw something completely different for no reason, right? There's no rhyme or reason to it, which used to be one of the great things about Tony Ferguson, and now I think it's kind of hurting him in some of these fights. So the keys for Tony are to do what he did well against Bobby Green and Michael Chandler when he was winning those fights. Output. It has to be output. I think that's the main thing that jumps off the page to me, because as much as Paddy can come back and hit him with something big and put him in trouble, Paddy is quite hittable. I say quite. He is hittable. His offense is very good, but defensively sometimes isn't the best. And he makes up for that, I think, with the fact that he is such a good opportunistic finisher, and so it kind of makes people a little bit concerned. But we have seen many times from Tony Ferguson that he is not concerned about having to take a couple of shots in order to land his own. So I don't think that'll be a problem. Training with David Goggins, I suppose we should bring that up. I can't believe I'm having to talk about that on an episode of Devil's Advocate. I don't think that's going to help.
What the fuck you want?
However, Tony has spoken a lot throughout this losing streak about how he hasn't really been training or preparing his body well enough, and so I think maybe mentally is where it might have a benefit for Tony Ferguson, in terms of like, he now feels like he's prepared and he's put himself through the worst thing he can put himself through, so he's ready to go to war. Maybe in some of those other fights he seemed a little bit too... The Bobby Green one, I know that he got poked in the eye, but to get taken down and submitted by Bobby Green, you're like, that's Tony Ferguson, man. Like, yeah, I don't know. But I think we've summed it up, right? So how can Tony El Kukui Ferguson snap the losing streak and beat Paddy Pimblett? He has to throw more output, and he has to keep his output focused. He can't just be windmilling around. Use your experience, right? Do I expect him to go in there and mix it up, take Paddy Pimblett down? I don't. I just don't. If he was really that desperate for a win, he would have tried that already against... I mean, I say against Bobby Green. Bobby Green took him down, submitted him, so whatever. And Nate Diaz, he just wanted to trade. It's a weird one. Trying to reason with the decisions of Tony Ferguson is not easy, and I say that as a huge Tony Ferguson fan. But everyone will point to the experience. People will point to the fact that Paddy is hittable. Everyone's always going to talk about that with Paddy. That it's like, well, why don't you just catch him and put him out? And that's going to happen a lot. Trust me, it's happened throughout all of Paddy's career. So I think that's about it, because we don't need to talk about wrestling. I don't think we need to talk about grappling. Output. Keep it focused and experienced, right? Because, like I said, Paddy is a very good opportunistic finisher, so I think the experience will definitely help Tony Ferguson in this fight. And I think that'll just about do it. I can't believe I'm doing a Devil's Advocate video on Paddy the Baddy Pimblett taking on Tony El Kukui Ferguson. What a strange time to be a UK MMA fan and to be a huge Tony Ferguson fan. It is bizarre. But hey, some incredible fights on this UFC 296 card. Was debating doing a Devil's Advocate for Shavkat and Wonderboy, but what am I really going to say? Just Shavkat is unbeaten, so there's not a whole lot to take from some of his fights. And Wonderboy, you're like, don't get taken down, but then the fights where he's fought grapplers, he gets taken down, so yeah, I don't know. And final card of the year, let's do it. I'm excited for this event, and there's so many UK fighters on it, so yeah, buzzing. That's about it. I'll catch you on the next one. Enjoy the fights.
Bye.